There are moments in human history when silence becomes so rare that it almost seems like an act of rebellion. We live in an era that has transformed visibility into a virtue and absence into an offense. People breathe urgency, seeking attention, as if their very existence depended on being seen, remembered, quoted, shared. The modern world has built an altar for permanent exposure, and many kneel before it without realizing the price they pay. Whenever I observe this movement, I realize how the human soul suffers when it is torn from its natural territory, interiority. It's as if everyone is being pushed out of themselves, forced to live in digital shop windows, where every thought needs to be packaged, interpreted, and displayed to gain meaning. But I wonder, what kind of essence can survive the constant light of others' eyes? For years I have been studying the subtle energy of the psyche, and I have understood that what truly grows within us is never born amidst applause. Profound transformation requires shadow, withdrawal, a kind of silence that is not absence but alchemy. When I see someone trying to evolve while remaining exposed to the continuous judgment of the world, I am reminded that it is impossible to ignite a spiritual flame when the external winds do not cease. And this is the contemporary drama. Everyone wants to change, but no one accepts disappearing. Everyone wants to be reborn, but they fear the symbolic death necessary for this to happen. And it is at this point that I usually ask a question that bothers even those who consider themselves strong. How do you expect to discover who you really are, if all the time you are being shaped by the expectations of others? The truth is that constant presence in the world creates an invisible prison. Every message answered immediately, every notification attended to without reflection, every social gesture returned out of obligation drains a little of the vital energy that should be used for inner reconstruction. And yet, so many believe they cannot step away even for a moment, as if silence were a kind of judgment or abandonment. But I affirm, with the authority of someone who has dedicated years to the study of human interiority, silence is not abandonment. Silence is a summons. It calls forth what lies dormant within you so that it may finally awaken. Some say that disappearing is a selfish act. I say it's a sacred one. Consciously withdrawing from the world is not escape, it's a return. It's the path of those who understand that the soul needs solitude to recover its strength, its memory, and its integrity. When I guide someone to enter this state of recollection, I'm not proposing social isolation, but a change of frequency. It's as if I were saying, step away from the noise to hear what really matters. And those who listen to me sincerely quickly discover something that has always been before them, but they never noticed. Much of what they called personality was merely reflection, conditioning, repetition. Strategic disappearance is not an invitation to non-existence, but to metamorphosis. There is a turning point in the life of anyone who decides to change profoundly. A silent moment when something inside says, it is no longer possible to continue being who I was. This moment is the threshold between two realities, and only those who have the courage to retreat from the world can cross this border. When I reflect on the experiences of those I have guided over the years, I observe a clear pattern. The greatest evolutionary leaps occurred when they allowed themselves to exist away from the eyes of others. Not because the world is an enemy, but because its constant presence prevents the essence from reorganizing itself. And perhaps you've already felt this. Perhaps at some point you wish to disappear for a few days, not out of exhaustion, but out of intuition. Perhaps you've realized that continuous exposure feeds a version of yourself that no longer corresponds to who you want to be. Perhaps you've even imagined what it would be like to live an entire phase of life in silence, without warnings, without explanations, just you and what spontaneously arises within your consciousness. If this thought has crossed your mind, it's because a deeper part of you is calling, and the call never comes for nothing. The truth is, the world offers no space for silent rebirths. Therefore, when someone decides to retreat, they need to do so with intention, courage, and clarity. And here begins the real journey, understanding that disappearing doesn't mean getting lost, but rediscovering oneself. Those who dare to vanish from the surface of their own lives enter a territory I call the subterranean field of the soul, where no mask survives, where all noise dissolves, and where every emotional fragment you tried to ignore finally appears. And although this crossing is uncomfortable, it is absolutely necessary for the new to emerge. Therefore, before we move forward, I want you to reflect. To what extent has your constant presence in the world prevented your true expansion? Because it is precisely at that limit, at the exact point where you realize you can no longer sustain the old, that transformation begins. And it all starts with the courage to disappear. When someone decides to reduce their presence in the world, even discreetly, a curious reaction arises. People find it strange, they question it, they try to understand, not because they truly care, but because they've become accustomed to their constant availability. The simple act of not responding so quickly is already seen as a sign of anomaly, and this is where many back down not for lack of willingness to change, but for fear of displeasing others. I always observe this carefully. The human mind fears emptiness, and when you create space within yourself, those who live with you feel this vacuum as a threat. They want to pull you back to the pattern, not out of malice, but to restore the old balance. But I offer a warning. If you succumb to external pressure at this initial moment, you lose the chance to cross the most important boundary of your life. Generally, the first impacts of strategic disappearance arise in the most common, everyday situations. That friend who texts you every day starts asking if you're angry. A coworker notices you no longer participate in the pointless conversations that used to consume your energy. Your family interprets your quietness as discouragement, and little by little, you realize something essential. Your presence fueled expectations you never chose. It's at this moment that many people come to me in anguish, saying they feel guilty for not meeting others' expectations. But I explain that this guilt isn't real. It's merely a reflection of the social conditioning that teaches us to exist outwardly, not inwardly. When you begin to break this pattern, discomfort appears first in others and then in you. However, it is precisely this discomfort that needs to be overcome if you truly wish to be reborn. Sometimes, a few days' pause is all it takes for you to discover something that has always been hidden. Your mind was hyper-connected to a logic of demand, and by slowing down, you notice how easy it was to be manipulated by small urgencies. Notifications that once seemed important become irrelevant. The habit of checking messages loses its power. The need to respond quickly dissolves. It's as if you emerge from a fog that has confused your senses for years. And then the question I've heard so many times in my guidance sessions arises: why have I lived so long? This question marks a turning point in the journey because it reveals that your consciousness is finally awakening. But make no mistake, inner change doesn't come as immediate relief. In many cases, when the external turmoil ceases, the inner silence becomes almost deafening. It's common for old emotions to reappear, as if the silence had opened a passage to long-repressed content. Some people feel irritation for no apparent reason. Others experience mild anxiety, as if they had forgotten something important. There are also those who feel such a profound emptiness that they even believe they have done something wrong. And it is precisely here that my guidance becomes most necessary. I explain that this state is neither a mistake nor a sign of weakness. It is the first dive into the subterranean layer of the psyche, that region where the forces that shape your identity are kept without you realizing it. When the surface quiets down, what was hidden gains a voice. It is at this point that everyday accounts become revealing. I have witnessed people who, after only 3 days of social silence, discovered that they were living to please the expectations of someone who was no longer even part of their lives. Others realized that their constant good humor was a mask created to avoid conflict. Some noticed that their tiredness was not physical, but the result of always playing a role. When these insights arise, I always say the same phrase: now you've truly begun. Because before that, everything is still superficial. Transformation only begins when you face your inner mirror without filters. However, it is also at this moment that the world seems to intensify its attempt to recover you. Delayed messages arrive all at once. People who never showed interest in your life begin to ask if you are okay. Unexpected invitations arise. Opportunities that seem irresistible. Situations that test your discipline. This happens because the energy you withdrew from the world creates a perceptible displacement, and the world tries to fill the void you left. If you are not attentive, you may interpret these movements as signs that you should return to your old rhythm. But I tell you clearly, this is only the last gasp of the dying pattern. During this period, I recommend that you carefully observe every reaction from your surroundings. Who tries to get closer? Who is bothered by your silence? Who respects your new posture? These answers reveal more about others than you imagine. And above all, they reveal with whom you can or cannot continue walking when your new version finally emerges. Because, contrary to what many believe, strategic disappearance does not isolate, it selects, it filters, it reveals, and everything that is true remains. As the days go by, something unexpected begins to happen. You realize that the silence, which previously seemed heavy, begins to take on a different tone. It ceases to be absence and transforms into fertile ground, a space where your thoughts organize themselves, your emotions find rest, and your vital energy returns to its original axis. And when this internal reorganization begins, a feeling arises that few recognize immediately. You are returning to yourself, not to the fragmented version that the world knows, but to something deeper, clearer, and more whole. It is at this point in the journey that you finally understand that disappearing is not a gesture of weakness, but of strength, a movement that requires courage and clarity. And upon realizing this, a question inevitably arises that marks the beginning of the next stage. If silence has shown me so much about myself, what can it reveal if I delve even deeper? When you break through the first layer of silence, something inside you begins to move almost imperceptibly. It's not a sudden change, not a sudden snap. It's an internal shift, as if an old gear is starting to turn again after years of rust. Many don't perceive this movement immediately. They only feel that something is different. Thoughts seem clearer, emotions more honest, the body more present. And it is precisely in this state of greater lucidity that the mind tries to regain control, creating small distractions so that you don't go deeper. This happens because the psyche fears what is kept in the underground of consciousness. But it is precisely there that the truest part of you resides. It is at this moment that I begin to warn. Silence is only the door. What you find beyond it depends on your willingness to look at yourself without masks. Many people believe that self-knowledge is a tranquil journey, made of beautiful insights and motivational phrases. But in truth, it is much more like a descent into unknown territory. And this descent reveals things you would rather not see, fears you have ignored for years, accumulated guilt, repressed desires, silent betrayals you have committed against yourself. Most people retreat when these shadows begin to emerge, but you are here precisely because you decided not to run away. The curious thing is that, at this point in the journey, the external world tends to slow down, not because it has become calmer, but because your perception has changed. Things that once irritated you now seem distant. Other people's dramas no longer pull you in as they once did. And even problems that seemed urgent begin to lose their emotional weight. It's as if the silence has sharpened your sensitivity, allowing you to see what is truly important. But this doesn't happen without internal resistance. Many report feeling as if they are moving away from their old self, and I explain that this is exactly it. You are saying goodbye to a version of yourself that was built to survive, not to live. At this stage, the unconscious begins to send clearer signals. Sometimes they come in the form of intense dreams that seem to carry hidden messages. Sometimes they emerge as old memories, seemingly random, but charged with emotion. In other situations, you realize you are more sensitive to certain people, music, or places. All of this is a manifestation of the psyche trying to reorganize its internal contents. And even if you don't understand it immediately, the process is happening because the silence has created space for the inner truth to manifest itself. I always say that this phase is a kind of night of the soul, not because it's dark, but because it's intimate. It happens inside without witnesses. It's the stage where you encounter parts of yourself that were left behind. It's when you realize that your strength was never in your appearance, but in your ability to confront yourself. Silence, contrary to what many think, is not for escaping the world. It serves to recover what the world made you lose: your lucidity, your energy, your presence, your essence. And then, inevitably, a moment arrives that almost everyone describes with the same phrase: "I didn't know I was so lost." This phrase is not a sign of defeat, it's a sign of awakening, because only those who have finally found an internal point of reference realize they were lost. This point is the beginning of reconstruction. It's where you start to ask yourself, what do I really want? Who am I when no one is watching? What still makes sense to me? When these questions arise, you are no longer trapped in the automatic cycle that guided your life. You are, for the first time, choosing. But let's make it clear, This discovery doesn't bring euphoria. On the contrary, it brings depth, a dense, almost sacred calm, a silence that doesn't weigh you down, but envelops you. At that moment, you realize that what you called life was full of noise, and that much of what you did was merely a reflection of others' expectations. And when this realization arrives, everything superficial begins to lose its shine. People who once enchanted you begin to seem empty. Old ambitions dissolve. Even your thoughts change tone. You are, without even realizing it, becoming someone the world doesn't yet know. And it is precisely here that the journey begins to demand courage. Because when you transform internally, even if you remain silent, the external world begins to react. Some distance themselves, others draw closer. There are those who try to pull you back to your old self. There are also those who feel threatened by your new state of presence. This happens because your energy has changed, and everything around you responds to this change. But I always explain, none of this is personal. It is simply the natural dynamic of evolution. When you rise, not everyone can keep up. The third stage of strategic disappearance reveals a truth that few are prepared to face. Change isn't about improving. It's about becoming who you truly are. And that requires letting go of parts of yourself that you've carried for years. Some were imposed by the environment, others were fabricated by fear, and some still exist only because you never took the time to question them. Silence brings that time. And when you use it to look inward, everything that isn't yours begins to crumble. It is precisely at this point that the inner turning point occurs. It is not an emotional explosion. It is not a sudden epiphany. It is a profound and silent understanding. You don't need to explain yourself anymore. No need to justify yourself. No need to conform. You simply need to remain present within yourself. That is the power that silence awakens. A power that doesn't shout, but transforms. And with this strength being born within you, we reach the threshold of the next phase. Because after confronting your unconscious and traversing the inner night, an inevitable question arises. If I've already figured out what I need to leave behind, how do I begin to build something new? When you pierce the silent darkness of the unconscious and begin to see your own internal structure more clearly, a decisive moment arrives. It's that instant when you realize that reconstruction doesn't depend on external conditions, nor on perfect circumstances, nor on external validation. It begins within, in almost invisible layers, where your intentions, desires, and fears coexist like lines of force that shape your reality. And it is precisely at this point that many get lost. Because upon realizing that the inner world is greater than the outer one, they try to control everything at once. But this is the illusion that imprisons them most. True transformation never occurs through force. It happens through the silent reorganization of energy. I often explain that when silence begins to reorganize you from within, a kind of energy field forms around your presence. It's not visible, but it's perceptible. You notice this when people start behaving differently around you. Some feel calmer, others become restless. Some distance themselves without explanation. These movements are not a result of your words, but of the vibration you have begun to emit. The human psyche responds instinctively to changes in energy. And when you change, everything around you responds, even if no one understands why. This external reaction often confuses those who are in the process of rebuilding. You may feel like you're losing people, losing interests, losing the will for things that once guided you. But I always say, you're not losing anything. You're simply ceasing to sustain what never belonged to your truth. And when the truth begins to emerge, it pushes away everything that was built on illusions. This energetic cleansing is necessary, but it's also challenging, because, at the same time as you free yourself, you feel a strange emptiness forming around you, an inner space that was previously occupied by expectations, noise, and borrowed desires. This emptiness is not an enemy. It is the fertile ground where the new begins to sprout. But for this to happen, you need to allow the silence to continue guiding the construction, and this is where most fail. Many try to fill the void quickly, seeking new distractions, new connections, new activities, just to avoid the feeling of being alone with themselves. And I warn you, this is the mistake that interrupts evolution. Emptiness is not meant to be filled. It is meant to be understood, because only those who can bear to be alone with themselves without escape are able to shape their own reality. At this stage, curious signs begin to emerge. You realize that your perception of time changes. Simple moments seem longer, while superficial conversations become unbearably short. Your senses become more acute. You begin to notice details that previously went unnoticed. Subtle expressions of people, vibrations in environments, emotional signals hidden behind common words. All this is a consequence of the inner stillness you have been cultivating, and it is impossible to describe the impact of this expanded perception without touching on what many call intuition. But I prefer to say that it is simply consciousness functioning without interference. With this expansion, a silent process of natural separation also begins. You start to choose more carefully where you put your energy. To an outsider, this may seem like coldness, but it's not. It's discernment. Most people waste their energy on useless conflicts, irrelevant opinions, and meaningless battles. When you awaken, you realize that this is just a mechanism for emotional dispersion, and without announcing it, without explaining it, without justifying it, you stop participating in this charade, not out of arrogance but for protection, because when your energy is being rebuilt, any leakage can compromise the process. It is at this point that many realize their solitude has changed form. It ceases to be absence and becomes presence. You no longer feel isolated but centered. There is a profound difference between being alone and being within yourself. Those who have never immersed themselves in their own silence don't understand this difference. But those who have know exactly what I'm talking about. It's a feeling of being whole, of carrying within you an inner axis that doesn't depend on anyone, that doesn't waver with the opinions of others, that isn't destabilized by criticism or praise. It's a rare state, and it is this state that begins to build the new version of you. In the midst of this process, unexpected events begin to emerge. Small coincidences, unlikely encounters, conversations that seem synchronized with what you are experiencing internally. Many people call this synchronicity, and yes, that's an appropriate word, but I usually explain that it's nothing more than the mind, body, and energy finally aligned. When you align yourself internally, the external adjusts. Not like magic, but as a consequence, life begins to respond to your new state. It doesn't give you exactly what you want, but what you need to continue evolving. And it is precisely at this stage that reconstruction gains strength. You begin to realize that you don't need to rush. You don't need to prove anything. You don't need to convince anyone. Life ceases to be a constant battle and transforms into a process of observation and creation. But this creation is not impulsive as before. It is mature, silent, and centered. It is born from a deep understanding of who you are becoming. And at this point, the most important question of the journey arises: how can we consciously channel this new energy? This question isn't theoretical, it's practical, because by rebuilding your energy, you gain an inner power that cannot be wasted. And that's where the fourth stage ends, on the threshold between understanding and action, between who you were and who you are about to become. The door to the new opens when you understand that silence is no longer just protection. It's a tool, it's a strategy, it's power. When the rebuilt energy begins to stabilize within you, something new emerges, not as an isolated thought nor as a fleeting emotion, but as a continuous vibration, almost like an internal pulse that reorganizes everything around you. It is at this point that many realize, for the first time, that they no longer need to strive to be who they want to be. The strength that once demanded discipline, struggle, and resistance begins to flow naturally. It's as if life is finally answering your call, not because you asked for it, but because you have become capable of sustaining what you previously couldn't. This is the beginning of silent manifestation, a process in which your energy, now refined and cleaner, begins to shape circumstances with a precision you never imagined possible. I always say that this is where you need to be most cautious, not because there is danger, but because there is power. The power to attract, to influence, to cut, to bring closer, to open or close doors. And power, when born from a state of internal reconstruction, is extremely sensitive. It cannot be used impulsively, nor with remnants of old wounds you carry. If you try to move the world with old energy, everything becomes disorganized again. Therefore, before the action takes shape, you must observe yourself with the same depth with which you observe your thoughts during silence. Ask yourself, what part of me still reacts instead of deciding? The answer is always revealing. It is at this stage that the external world begins to test your newfound stability. People who previously seemed indifferent begin to reappear. Situations from the past resurface as invitations to old patterns. Conflicts you believed were overcome return to verify if your frequency has truly shifted, or if you have merely learned to hide within yourself. These tests are not punishments or traps. They are a natural part of the psychological and energetic process. The human psyche organizes itself through cycles, and when a cycle tries to repeat itself, it is because you are ready to end it definitively. Here I always warn, do not respond to old stimuli in the same way. Your new energy demands new movements, and perhaps you'll realize that even without saying anything, your presence bothers some people. This happens because your vibration no longer fits the expectations others had of you. They no longer recognize that old version that comforted or benefited them, and when you move away from the old dynamics, inevitably someone tries to pull you back, not out of malice but because their emotional system was balanced by yours. When you change, theirs becomes unbalanced, and this generates resistance. Therefore, at this stage, you need to be firm, not rude, not aggressive, but firm. Firmness is the shield of your reconstruction. As the days go by, you begin to notice a strange yet familiar sensation, the feeling that something big is about to happen. It's not anxious anticipation, nor disguised fear. It's an intuitive awareness, a kind of serene premonition that the path is about to change direction. This perception is a direct result of your heightened sensitivity. When you adjust your energy, you also adjust your ability to perceive subtle movements that ordinary people ignore. It's as if you pick up vibrations before they become facts. Many call this a sixth sense. I prefer to call it expanded lucidity, the mind functioning at its deepest level. This clarity also reveals an uncomfortable truth. Some of your old motivations no longer make sense, and this can generate an internal shock. You see that you fought for things that weren't yours, that you desired paths that never had anything to do with your essence, that you insisted on maintaining ties that drained your energy. It's painful to recognize this, but it's liberating, because from the moment you realize that you only got lost because you were trying to fit into spaces that were too small, you understand that the only possible path now is expansion. And expansion, as I always say, requires courage. The courage to let die what can no longer keep up with your pace. It is at this stage that important decisions arise, decisions that definitively reorganize your life. These are not dramatic or impulsive choices. They are calm, conscious, and irreversible choices. Choosing where to direct your energy. Choosing the type of presence you wish to have in the world. Choosing which connections still make sense and which need to be ended. Choosing the environments that strengthen your silence and distancing yourself from those that dilute it. These decisions are the true milestone of your energetic maturity. It is here that you cease to be someone who reacts to the world and become someone who shapes their own destiny. And something curious happens when you make these decisions. Life, almost imperceptibly, begins to align itself in your favor again. Doors that were previously closed open effortlessly. Opportunities that seemed distant appear at the exact moment. Synchronicity returns to act as a continuous flow, connecting pieces that, at first glance, had no relation whatsoever. But this time, you don't interpret it as luck. You know it's a consequence of your internal reorganization. You know that everything begins within and manifests outside. You know that your vibration is the language you use to communicate with the world. Therefore, in this fifth stage, you realize that you don't need to rush anything. The right movement happens at the right time. The rhythm of life ceases to be chaotic and becomes measured. And in this silent cadence, you understand something that changes everything. True strength lies not in what you achieve, but in what you sustain without losing your essence. This is the turning point. The energy is no longer unstable, scattered, or anxious. It is continuous, deep, and focused. It points in the direction of what you need to experience, and you finally understand that your reconstruction was not just an emotional process, it was an energetic rebirth. And it is precisely here, at this stage where your inner strength ceases to be a concept and becomes a real presence, that the narrative prepares for the climax. Because the sixth and final part is where everything comes together: introspection, energy, silence, destiny, and action. It is where you discover how to put into practice everything that has awakened within you. When you reach this final point in the journey, something within you no longer resembles what it once was. It's not just change, it's transmutation. The energy that once fluctuated, scattered by the demands of the world and the expectations of others, now pulsates with a stability that few can comprehend. It's as if you've discovered the hidden center of your own being, a silent and unwavering place that has always existed, but which you are only now able to sustain. I always say that this is the stage where the individual ceases to merely survive and finally begins to exist. Because to exist is not to occupy space, it is to occupy presence. It is to be able to influence the environment effortlessly, simply through the vibration you maintain. From here, your transformation needs to take shape in the physical world. All the accumulated energy, all the cultivated silence, all the clarity achieved only reaches its fullness when it manifests in conscious choices, attitudes, and movements. There is no true awakening that remains only within the mind. Awakening requires action, but not impulsive or anxious action. Action that springs from the center, aligned, stable, tranquil. Action that is almost a natural extension of your new inner state. All great spiritual traditions have understood this. It is not enough to illuminate consciousness if the steps remain trapped in old shadows. Therefore now, more than ever, you need to walk with crystal clear intentions. And it's important for you to know, the world will react to your new state. Some people will approach you with a respect they never showed before. Others will distance themselves because they can't handle your newfound strength. And that's natural. Evolution never happens without restructuring around you. When you change, your vibration changes. And when your vibration changes, your connections change. Don't try to hold on to what's leaving. Don't try to recover what silence has already dissolved. Life removes what doesn't support your next level. Life rebuilds what accompanies your maturity. Trust the movement. Trust the intelligence of this process. Trust who you have become. And perhaps you'll realize that now speaking less becomes a spontaneous choice. Not because you isolate yourself, but because you no longer feel the need to explain every detail of your mind to those who lack the depth to understand. Silence, which was once a refuge, now becomes a form of communication. Your presence speaks, your boundaries speak, your energy speaks. And those who need to understand without you saying a single word. It is here that many discover the power they have sought throughout their lives, but which they can only now sustain. The power of authenticity. The power to exist without asking permission. The power to occupy one's own light without fear of overshadowing anyone. This is the point where you need to focus your attention on what you truly want to build from now on. Not just mentally, energetically. Because your choices from now on carry a different weight. You've stopped being someone who reacts to the world and have become someone who shapes it. This means that every intention needs to be aligned with what you want to experience, not what you want to avoid. Fears can no longer be your compass. The need to please can no longer guide your steps. Guilt can no longer be the filter for your decisions. You have a new internal reference point, a new frequency, a new direction. Ask yourself, what kind of life corresponds to the energy that now vibrates within me? And then listen. The answer will not come as an unstable emotion, but as a serene, deep, and direct feeling. The psyche, when aligned, knows exactly what it needs. It just doesn't shout. It whispers. And it is in that whisper that you find your true path, not the path of the wounded ego, but the path of mature consciousness. Perhaps you'll notice your priorities beginning to shift. Things that once seemed essential now lose importance. Bonds you once maintained out of obligation now dissolve naturally. Environments that once held your energy now provoke a strange feeling of awkwardness. This is your new vibrational field reorganizing your reality. Don't fight this reorganization. It's necessary. Expansion requires space. And the universe always removes what hinders expansion, even if you haven't yet realized that it was no longer part of your path. Now, I want you to understand one last truth. His silence is not absence. It is presence in its highest form. When you choose to remain silent, your energy becomes clearer, stronger, more penetrating. It stops scattering and starts influencing. It stops fragmenting and starts building. And that's what makes the people around you react in unexpected ways. Some will feel inspired, others will feel threatened. but none will remain indifferent. Indifference disappears when someone discovers their own strength. And that's why, in this final phase, I say with complete clarity, you no longer need to prove anything to anyone. You no longer need to fight to be seen, recognized, or valued. Those who need to see you will see you. Those who are not prepared for your presence will distance themselves. And those who remain will remain because they can sustain the depth you now demand. Superficial relationships dissolve. True connections become more evident. Life takes care of aligning everything in your favor when you learn to align yourself. And so we arrive at the point where their transformation ceases to be internal and inevitably becomes visible. The world will not only see change, it will see coherence, it will see firmness. It will see someone who has silently rebuilt themselves and now walks with a strength that needs no announcement. And this silent firmness is the true culmination of the entire journey. Now, before we wrap up, I want you to do something simple but essential. If this content touched you, if it made sense, if it awakened something inside you, even if you can't explain it, then I ask you, leave your comment, even if it's just a period, a word, anything, and subscribe to the channel, not only to support the work, but to continue receiving content that sustains this new stage of your life. Your journey doesn't end here. She's only just begun.